The self-matting system
Self-matting.
starts with color film, it ends up with black and white. And it was used on Flubber and The Son of Flubber, I think, were the two movies it was used on. But at that point, then nobody wanted to make black and white films, so they went to the sodium system at that point. But it was an interesting approach. It was the first time I think he actually thought about it. You know, the problem itself was to come up with that.
Ned!
Did you see what I saw?
I hope not.
I remember the day, it was in maybe 59, I think it was, 1959. I would have been 12 years old, I guess. And Petro came home, and he said, "Guess who I had lunch with today?" And I said, "Who?" And he said, "Walt Disney." I said, "You're kidding me. You had lunch with Walt Disney?" He says, "Yeah, I got invited to the studio, and you know, because they bought that, they're doing the sodium thing, and Walt wanted to meet the guy that invented it, and so I got to have lunch with him." And you know, as a little kid, I was just, like all of us, were enamored with Walt Disney, you know. So I thought that was a fun day. And then he really caps it off, and he says, "Yeah, we were there, and Clark Gable walks in, and Walt says, 'Hey, Clark, come over here. I'd like you to meet Petro.' And so he said he sat down and had lunch with us. So you know, it's and Petro just doesn't care about this stuff at all. You know, he's so wrapped up in the technology, he doesn't understand that you know, the icons that these people are, and how anybody would be very excited about it. I'm sitting here, you know, just jumping up and down at the table, right? And he's wondering what's wrong with me. Yes. At first it was called ARP, Applied Research Products, and so when Petro was finally free to join it, he came in and started. So in a sense, I was here before my dad was. When the Motion Picture Producers Association dropped the research center at that time, and he was free, then he came into ARP. They immediately changed the name from ARP to Vlahos Gottschalk Research Corporation, which of course became VGR pretty quick. So from the very beginning, yeah, I actually was there before Petro was, in that sense. My role, of course, at first, you know, look, you're raised in a household where your dad has been, you know, called Hollywood's premier scientist, and all these accolades, and you know, I remember the Oscar that was for those drive-in movie screens, and then I remember the Oscar for, which I actually went to the awards, got to see him get that one in 1964, and actually sat next to Rosalind Russell, of all things, which was kind of fun, you know. I remember sitting down, looking over, and I go, "I know who this is." And then she was kind enough to look at me and say, "Hello," you know, and she shook my hand and said who she was, and I said, "I know who you are." It was fun, but so I never wanted to be compared with him, and so I made a point of completely not doing anything that was technology. So I studied economics, and because it was easy to understand, and that was sort of what I did. I was a musician, and spent my youth then not being at all serious or focused and interested in technology. You know, college was a way of avoiding the draft. And when I was finally free of that, why, I spent my time, you know, newly married, sort of an extended honeymoon, being an extra in the movie business. Spent 7 years, I think, doing that. Made my living at it. I didn't do anything else, and lots of great experiences. And I didn't realize until later what I was learning was going to be valuable later. So that when I started with this thing, it was more a matter of here's an opportunity to get back and be with my father, who I enjoyed. I loved being with him, and you know, when I reached a certain age, I moved away. I got married, and it was on my own for a number of years, and I missed him. You know, I missed the intellectual challenges. And so when I had started doing this thing for Bill Gottschalk with this 3D, and Petro joined the thing, well, then there I was. You know, it's just one of those kinds of things. So it's pure nepotism. It wasn't because I had any special, unique talents. I wasn't trained in any way, you know, in the industry. Nothing in that background would have been ideally suited to any of this stuff. So from the standpoint of, you know, just the nepotism of the whole thing, why I was there right from the very beginning. And so my first things were just do whatever needed to be done that I was capable of doing, and that's what I did. So it was a lot of fun. And then at that point, I started to learn how to use all the test equipment and checked them out. Because in the analog days, we would actually hand select chips and make all kinds of pot adjustments and so forth to get the frequencies the way they were supposed to be. And there was the entire process that went through. There was something like, I don't know, 80 adjustments that we had to make and hand select resistors and the rest of it so that we got those things nailed perfectly. So yeah, I was doing some of the checkout. My mom was stuffing those boards, and we had other people, other engineers and buyers and secretaries and sales and that kind of thing. But that part of it, we were all down there in those early days. So it was, you know, so you know, there is something that happens to you. And I think it's one of the reasons why nepotism has a bad name in some areas, but Hollywood is rife with it. And you know, I realized later that I spent my entire youth where after dinner, you know, out on the table, Dad would lay out some paper and he'd start describing what he was doing that day. And I'd get, you know, all these graphs of mats that were happening, and you know, when he was developing the blue screen system and how that self-matting system was working and what he had done on some of these other things. And you don't even realize what you're absorbing, you know, with all of that. It's because it's not a conscious effort, it's just there. And so when you step up to the plate to try and do some things, it seems like everything soaks in much faster than it does for the other guy, you know, whose father's doing something else. So maybe it's whether you call it culture or whatever, but it was then easy for me, I think, to become effective at some point. I think the first real contribution I made, I had, we were having some success selling these systems. Petro had decided that he could do one from an encoded signals. He would use the RGB to create the alpha channel, and then he would take the encoded signal from the camera and do a suppression of the blue screens and the building of the mats and so forth on that the NTSC image, single channel. And this was ideally suited for the switchers that were not dealing with RGB. They were literally made to pass NTSC signals around. And we wanted something to integrate. So he had started to build that. In the meantime, I think it was NBC in New York had seen the Ultimats and realized that they were amazing. And so they said, we would like to test this thing. So I said, fine. And I flew back to New York. I was going to set the thing up and train them on how to use it. And it was sort of a test. And it was kind of an interesting experience for me, because I got in there and I didn't, you know, I mean, I understand the dynamics of unions and so forth, because I certainly dealt with them a number of years when I was on the motion picture sets. And there are a lot of things that go on that aren't necessarily the most honorable things, you know. So it took me a while to understand what was going on, but I set up the Ultimat and it made a gorgeous picture, you know. And here's the guy who's operating the camera, and he's got his console and all these sliders and so forth. And so I get done and I'm seeing sliding these things around, and well, there was nothing automated about that Ultimat. It had several knobs and switches, and you had to go and make all these adjustments to, you know, suppress the blue screen with the bias controls to get the red, blue, green contamination down to a 0. You had the mat adjustments. There was the control signal up to a unity, and you know, and some of the gate functions to deal with a spill would be set based upon the images that were coming in. Well, if someone goes and messes with the iris, changes those levels, I've got to go back and make new adjustments. And if somebody messes with the paint pots, then again I've got to mess with the bias controls and the matte controls. And so I get done with this thing, and the camera guy he's adjusting these things. So I said, wait a minute, look, the way this thing has to work is you have to adjust the camera so you like what you see, and when you're done, you have to be done. I'm going to set this thing. So he says, okay. And so I go ahead and I set the thing up. And then I watched him do it again. I said, look, I really mean this. This isn't going to work at all otherwise. So he said, all right. So I adjusted it, and I'm sitting there and I'm watching, and he's just waiting. And so, you know, so at that point I figured, I'll walk away. I walked away, and I went down the end of the equipment rack, and I went around the back side, and I came around, so I was on the other side of him now. And he's sitting there, and he's looking around, and I can see him looking and looking, and then pretty soon I see him, when he sees he can't see me, he reaches out and he hits 2 paint pots just like that, and he sits back, knowing full well he totally messed up the picture. And I said, oh, that's it. This isn't going to work. They just don't want this thing in here. And I began to understand right now with the Chroma Keyer, that was a device that would be set by the technical director on the switcher. 3 knobs, clip and gain, and so that was fine, you know. And now, but the Ultimat, it was way too complicated for the technical director because it was a lot of knobs that needed to be adjusted, and these guys just didn't want to have to address taking on this new device and all of these controls and learning them and operating them when the Chroma Keyer was being done by somebody else. So my guess is that's what was going on. But I remember being pretty down about it. And I got on the airplane to fly back, and it was on the way back that I figured out how to automate all those controls. So it was the Ultimat 4 that I had taken and had set up, and that they were all excited about. Well, I had been told by both Petro and some of the other engineers that were with us at that time that it was not possible to automate these controls. And well, it was a challenge, you know. But then when I realized what had happened there, on the way back, I came up with the concept of scanning a frame and locating what I called peak blue. So as I would check, as you'd go through and as you look at the scan, it was going across, there would be an RGB. And at one point, if you were developing a matte, in a sense, from every pixel, you'd find that there would be one point where the blue would be as high as possible, and the red and the green would be, the separation between that blue and the red and green would be at the most, that's what we call the peak, where it would be the greatest separation. And that would then represent definitely the bluest blue that would be on that frame. And if I know what that is, what that RGB value is, well, I can utilize that then to say, all right, generally the bulk of the screen is going to be this color. All right, so if I know what those RGB values are, I can utilize that information to know how much biasing to take it to a black. Anything that's up from that, we'll just let it be up from that as it should be. Right? And then at the same time, if I know that's the peak blue, I know this is what has to be pushed into a clip, or they're just at the clip point. And those functions can be done automatically. So now what that does is it frees you up from the paint pots, which is what made you adjust the biases, and it frees you up from the iris, which is what made you adjust the BG level. So I came back and got on the blackboard and said, look, try it like this. And I came out with all these formulas and said, this is what we can do. And they got all excited and tried it, and that changed the news mat. So instead of releasing it as we had expected to do with a bunch of controls to adjust those things, we went ahead and put that into it and released that. And I got to go back to NBC, and we slipped it in. And the guy was with us, you know, with the iris and the paint pots. He was just doing it all, and it just made a perfect picture all the time. It never stopped. That was the first innovation that I put into the mix, and began to realize that maybe I could be effective at doing some things. Well, that resulted in that product being sold by the hundreds into the broadcast industry, whereas otherwise we were making headway into the production business, where everybody could sit there and make all these fine adjustments and everything. But it's a very different demand when you're in a live broadcast environment than if you're in a production environment. And there they really needed it. And now the technical director was thrilled because he didn't have to make any adjustments. It was one of these things where he pushed the initial button and everything was automatically set up just like that. And if I had too much blue in the foreground, well, I would just simply adjust the matte density control, and the rest was tracking, and that was all there was to it. So it actually had sort of less controls than his Chroma Keyer did. And if the camera guy didn't like the way the picture looked and he wanted to iris it up a little bit or down or change a paint pot, It didn't blow the composite where you had to go back now and make some adjustments. And I don't know if you remember in the old days, but when you had those old Chroma Keyers up there, every once in a while you'd suddenly start to see things change and the background would go away, you'd start to see blue and everything. Well, the Chroma Keyer was, well, it's in the name, chroma, color, key, meaning switch. There was a methodology by which you would where you would determine what the color of the blue was that you wanted to switch. And so you would make an adjustment, and a Chroma Keyer would literally key off of any color. Didn't make any difference what it was. You'd be able to adjust this thing around so there'd be both chroma and amplitude were the two things that you'd be looking for on the blue screen. And when you had those nailed in, then it would switch from that color to anything to another color, whatever the foregrounds were. And what you'd do is you'd say, well, okay, if I'm going to switch and this is where the idea of the clip and gain, the gain is saying, oh, how far off of this predetermined color that I've discovered will I go before I do the switch? Well, if you made it as just a little bit of variation, well, then you would get not that much contamination, but all the transitions that had a little bit of blue in them would get clipped off, which meant the hair would just get tight, really, really tight, and the edges would cut in. Fingers would sometimes even disappear, but there'd be very little blue spill. So if you went the other way, you say, well, we can't have that much loss of everything. The guy's losing his fingers, you know. So you'd say, okay, well, we'll allow then the blue to be a little bit more blue, and that would then bring in the transition, some of the transitions, but you'd see the blue in the transitions. Now if you have a shadow, that was impossible, because here I've just got a darker blue. It would fall out of the clip, and so you'd just see a dark blue thing, you know. So that's the way it looked, and it was really kind of reserved just for you know, cheap commercials, weather casting, and children's shows. It really wasn't used for anything much beyond that, just because it looked so bad. The way the Ultimat worked was quite a bit different. I mean, here we said, no, we're not going to do a switch. What we're going to do is we're going to locate the color of that blue and literally subtract from the image that blue, so that those areas that were blue are now black. And we're going to create an alpha channel. It's a linear alpha channel, where any variation from that blue would go from, let's say, 100% where it was that blue. Any variation would then represent a linear transition into a black. Shadows, all the hair detail, and because of the subtraction. And then when you would combine it with the background, you'd take the subtracted image where the blue is now black, and you'd use that alpha channel, it was fully linear, and you'd just sum it with the foreground. You just add them together. Literally, you just take the alpha channel, multiply the background, and then take that process foreground and just add it. So it was a multiply and add. As a result, you didn't lose any hair detail. There was no blue fringe. The shadows looked beautiful. It was an interesting story. When we did that, Ultimat 3, I guess it was, we built 5 of them, just for rental only. We had just finished the 4. Someone at the Television Academy had seen it and got so excited they brought us down and we demonstrated it. And the committee that gives the Technical Awards Committee saw it and gave us an Emmy. And we hadn't even released the product yet, which violated all of their principles. But they were all technical, and they were all very familiar with what the Chroma Keyers were. And this was now not just an incremental, you know, I mean, most of the things that we do represent incremental improvements. This went from chroma key to absolute perfection in one step. It wasn't an incremental, it was just a total sea change. And they recognized it and they gave us that award. We never embarrassed them. It actually then went on to be everything that it did take over completely, and completely pushed out the Chroma Keyers. They had gone ahead and created a device that was just like our Newsmat. And when I'd heard about it, I simply went up to them and I said, well, guys, you've got this device. I said, but it's essentially the Newsmat. And when I showed them the patents, they said, oh yeah, you're right. Okay, well, can we license it? And I said, of course you can license it. And so the license. What's interesting about it, though, is that what they had, though, was the device that Petro had developed before I did the automation. So it actually had the adjustments. And they went ahead and put that in. It looked fine, though. It looked as good as our newsmat. It was just basically the same ideas that were being used. And that lasted until the patents ran out. And then it's free to anybody who can develop it using that technology. The whole idea of a patent is you teach the world how to do something in exchange for a certain length of time where you have some exclusivity. So if the world doesn't pick it up after the patents expire, there's something wrong, you know. I had Richard Patterson, who had at the time, I think he came from American Cinematographer, where he was the editor, and he had moved away from that position, and I brought him into the company. And we have been doing all these things with analog electronics at that point. And he claimed that this is something that we could do in software. So I said, really, Richard? And he says, yeah, let me try it. I said, no, go ahead. So he literally started on creating then that very first software rendition of it. And he got about halfway through. My business downturned. I laid him off, and I had George Sauvé, who was a real trained software engineer. I mean, literally, Richard Patterson was a brilliant man. I have nothing but respect for him. But he's literally teaching himself software programming while he was doing this thing. That's how smart he was. But I couldn't maintain that effort, and so I turned it over to George Sauvé, who then finished that off, and that became, I think, the Photo Fusion. In fact, Richard Patterson came back and did much of the interface, the human interface, for the Photo Fusion product after that, as just sort of freelancing for it. And then Kodak came and saw that example that Richard Patterson had done, which was getting most of the functions working, although it hadn't been productized. And that led to them then taking a license for their Cineon system. I recognized then from the Photo Fusion that it was time to go ahead and productize this in a much bigger way. And so I went and I talked to my friend Ray Feeney and said, Ray, I've got a whole series of ideas about how this interface needs to be, and laid out a whole program of things. Now, he had had experience with software and developing it, and had a team there. And so, and then we're dealing with all these different standards, compression standards, and so we then joint developed then the Cinefusion software. This is going to maybe 1993, so that by 94, 93, late 93, we released it. And it was just a revelation to the industry, because up until that time, all the compositing had been done, not with software, but photochemically. And now here was a way where we're using these Onyx computers. There was enough software that was there, the digitization was there, and the rest of it, so that we were now able to make amazing. I think the very first one I remember went out to, they were doing Cliffhanger. And so they had done a bunch of they had already done the composites, and but here was the digitized blue screens, and I said, come on, let me show you. And I set it up, and I made the adjustments and so forth, and the mats were phenomenal. And they immediately just dropped the old ones and put these in instead. And so I think the very first movie that then utilized the new software was Cliffhanger through Edlin's facility. And that and it just went very, very fast. I mean, literally within 6 months, every major studio had it and was using it. It was that fast. It was startling. And that's what, of course, anytime, and then suddenly we were seeing motion pictures that were heavily blue screened at that point. Just all of a sudden, out of no place, it just seemed like it was just being used on everything. And in a whole genre of motion pictures, that was an amazing time if you think about the movies that came out that were so special effects focused. And a lot of that had to do with this sort of digital revolution that was occurring. And the Cinefusion software was definitely sort of one of those building blocks that made up that digital revolution. There were times when things got a little bit rough. You know, it's always been a wave, a cyclical thing. Went to analog to digital. There was a wave that was there. When we got the screen correction to work, before you had moving cameras, everything was lock off. It was a revelation. So, you know, everybody dumped the Ultimat 4s and the Ultimat 5s in order to get those new features. Then when we first did that Newsmat, we made a lot of devices that went out in the world, and people were doing electronic sets. Instead of reserving the blue screen just for when the guy was standing in front of the weather map, that you know, you'd have a desk sitting there, but everything that was behind you now was blue screened in. So the entire set now was an image that had been created. Sometimes just a photograph that they used, but sometimes it'd be artist renditions as well. But the problem with it is that we were dealing with cameras that had to be locked off. So it was a lot of cuts. Go from a wide shot to a 2-shot to a medium shot to close-up. And you know, you'd always get these situations where, okay, now it was time to talk about this story, about this shooting, and so they want to have a picture of a gun up here, you know. So, well, the guy's in the center, which means he had to be slid over. Well, as soon as you slid him over, you realized that the background wasn't changing, so it looked like he was floating over, you know. And a couple of those incidences, and everybody's going, you know, this isn't really working as well as we thought. It's a static-looking set. And that's when I began to think, well, you know, if we're going to start losing some sales to this, I've got to come up with some reason to create more blue rooms. And that's when I began to think of the ideas around the memory head, a motion control head that I could use to both capture backgrounds as well as foregrounds. I also love the idea of using it for just plain production. But I designed this thing, though, with the idea that I want to be able to do this on a set. So put into it a plug that would then put out all that positional information, all that digitized positional information. And I built into it a system that, you know, I had like a rubber coupling that was on this handle. And that would give it a little bit of sponginess, that would give it a feeling of like a fluid head. But I realized that if I was to go ahead and take that digitized information, make it available at the plug so that it could be immediately sent out to, well, I have to tell you, at the time, it was before these computers had come along, the Onyxes and the rest, and I was thinking in terms of DVE, kaleidoscope, and that Grass Valley was making. And I took a couple of trips up to Grass Valley, sat down with their president, Bob Wilson, and said, look, this is the future, guys. You've got this thing, the kaleidoscope. It's a very fancy DV device. It's excellent, because, you know, you could go with a much larger picture, higher res, and you could roam around it and so forth. And this is just ideal. So I said, you know, you just simply need to build an interface so that the output of this thing can drive it, and you've got a whole nother life to this product, I promise you. I just couldn't make any traction at all. I visited Ampex, made the same pitch, couldn't get anywhere. It was John Galt then that I went to, and I said, I've got this memory head, and I'm trying to, you know, make one of these things happen. And he said, yeah, okay, let me see. We've got a device called the DME, digital, I don't know, motion. He'll tell you what it was. And so we got together and created the first real virtual studio for Atlanta in 1990. It was done with high definition. And we'd set up a set that had a blue wall. It was a living room with a blue wall. And what we had then was sort of this living room of the future, you know. So as you'd take the camera, you could then roam around the whole room, seeing everything. But when you came around to where the blue wall is, it had like a football game that was felt like it was just coming right off the wall. And you could walk up to the wall and, you know, walk around and do the pan, tilt, and zooming of this whole room, and it was just locked together perfectly. And so I drug over everybody from Grass Valley and everybody from Ampex and said, see, and I just couldn't make any, just nothing would happen. And I didn't realize how difficult it is sometimes when you take a new technology to get it to click. It doesn't happen overnight. But that was 1990. John and I proceeded then for every year after that to show some variation of it. Finally, in 1993, I got with Post Group, and I had them create an animated background of a room, so that it was like a tape. And we'd play that tape, and the time code reader that had built into the memory head would then trigger based upon when you'd start the tape, and it'd match up the moves to it. And so we're there showing this at the NAB. You know, I mean, I'm now into, let's see, 90, 91, 92, 93. This is the fourth time now I trotted this out, waiting for somebody to salute as I run up the flagpole, and I was just getting nowhere. You know, I was beginning to wonder if I was not, maybe I'm not grounded in reality. And the board of directors wondering, gee, Paul, you spent tons of money on that memory head. I mean, I spent a lot of money on it. And, you know, what's going on? So I'm showing this thing, and up walks these guys from IMP, an Austrian company, and they had developed this software that was meant to replace all these component pieces to put together a scene for like doing elections or sports shows, where traditionally you'd have a character generator and a DVE and a switcher that would put all these things together with multiple sources. And, you know, picture within picture kind of stuff. And they decided, you know, rather than have all these pieces of equipment that are so cumbersome, we could add a lot of flexibility and more spontaneity as the scores come in, almost play them instantly, if we did all this in software. So they had developed that software for that purpose. And when they came up and they saw what we were doing, they got very excited. And they come up and says, you know, we have something that we'd like to talk to you about. But, you know, all of this move that you're doing here, is there any way to get that data out of that box? And I had the pleasure of being able to say, yes, this plug right here. So that was it. They got very excited about it. And then they came over to our studio, planted themselves there for weeks while we developed all the interface and the first shows. And at the next NAB in '94, we then showed the full-blown, tied-together virtual studio. And of course, that was Karl Heinz, and he's now, and that whole software has become VizRT. There was another company, VAP, it was a German company that was there almost at the same time, and we worked with them as well to develop their software, because we were looking to develop as many blue rooms as we could. So any of the players that wanted to step forward, of course, we're going to fully cooperate. And that evolved into what is now ORAD. So that's basically how the whole thing got started. But as a result, it was important to us because that has now become like a production genre. It's much more popular in Asian countries and in Europe and so forth than it is here in the United States, although it is beginning to catch on here now finally. But obviously, we don't have the same space requirements. If we want to have, you know, a studio that's got 4 or 5 sets on it, each all separate, that's fine. We've got plenty of room. But in some of these other places, they don't have all that room. So the idea of having one space where I could just change the set from the morning news set to the interview set to the afternoon news, just by pushing a button, was very attractive to them. So they were really the first to get in and really make good use out of the virtual studios. Of course, you know, this is a mature industry. This motion picture industry, the television industry. We had a mature industry at one point when everything was photochemical. You know, optical printers that had been around from the 30s were being used in the 1960s to create, you know, the kinds of effects and so forth that we're seeing on features like Star Wars, for example. But it was after that we began the computer. Came along, and the idea of digitizing an image. When that happened, now we were in pioneer days, and all kinds of new players came in. It was very exciting, the stuff that was going on. Now, you know, now we're back into a mature situation again. Most everything has been done. Now it's just a matter of making it easier for people to use and automating many of the things that are going on, adding more intelligence on that basis. But the dozens and dozens and dozens of players that were once there have kind of been shaken out to where there's only a few now. And most of the things that they're making are programs that do almost everything. And you know who the players are, you're very familiar with them. And so as you look at the Ultimats, you know, as a standards change, you go from standard definition to high definition. Well, now all the old equipment has to be dumped and new stuff comes out. We're going to the 3G standard, and that's people are, when they step up to that, then the old systems won't be useful anymore. And even though you have a situation where under the right conditions you can make a flawless composite that anybody can look at and not detect any faults, that's not the real world. The real world is that you know, you've got nasty scuffed up floors and lighting that's terrible, and people aren't paying attention to wardrobe, and cameras have problems with how they're encoding and compressing, and the lenses have issues, and there's a lot of things there that can create problems. And so as we move forward, it's a matter of addressing some of these additional external problems so that you allow people to live in that real world of terrible blue screens and bad lighting and cameras and so on, and still make a good result. And so that's where a lot of the changes that we've put into most recent devices are literally dealing with these kinds of issues. So, we recognize there are many of these areas where there is still progress that can be made. And so we continue to do that. It seems like every time we come out with a new Ultimat with these new sets of features, there are a certain number of people that get the new one and retire the old. I have no idea how long Ultimat will continue to occupy the niche that it's in. I think it'll last quite a bit. You know, when I first started this thing, I looked at the people in the industry, began to see after a few years that the average company lasted about 6 years. And there are very few players that were there in 1980 when I went to the first NAB. Now, I mean, the ones that were there are just a handful. Everybody's changed. There's companies that have come and gone. And I always thought that we would have been one of those companies that came and gone, that someone would knock us off in some way, shape, or form, and we would be gone. But well, here we are 30-something years later, and you know, we're still making these devices.